welcome back to Week 12 on JohnnyFreakInFantasy. Today I've got 16 wide receiver, running back, tight ends for you, and 10 defensive players to talk about. So we're going to go ahead and get started with our running backs going into this week. My number one running back is Josh Adams from Philadelphia, owning 33% of Yahoo leagues. In Week 11, he rushed 7 times for 53 yards, including a touchdown. He also added 3 receptions for 19 yards. He had a nice 28-yard touchdown. I do like him going forward as the lead back. He has a cake matchup versus the New York Giants, who allow the 10th most points to running backs in Week 12. His last 27 carries have gone for 178 yards on the ground. That's an average of 6.6. So I do like Josh Adams a lot moving forward. I think he's going to garner more touches out of that backfield. I think he's the running back, the only running back, as a matter of fact, to own back in Philadelphia now. So I do consider him as a mid to high range RB2 in Week 12 because of the matchup. Moving forward, I would expect him to stake his claim as a heralded running back too with significant upside. But for right now, I would consider him an RB2, and I do like Josh Adams a lot this week. Go ahead and pick him up. He should be a good stretch run ad as well. Number 2 is Gus Edwards from Baltimore, owned in 6% of Yahoo leagues. Somebody who came out of nowhere in Week 11 for 17 rushes with 115 yards and a touchdown. He also had a 2-point conversion. He looks to be the lead back for Week 12. He also got some coach praise. Harbaugh said he grabbed the bull by the horns with his Week 11 appearance, and I do think you could consider him as a mid-range RB2 in a cake matchup versus Oakland, Week 12. Oakland's allowed the 4th most points to running backs, and I do think that Gus Edwards is a good bet to keep this going down the stretch. The only reason I have him number 2 behind Adams is because of his role. We're really unsure of what we're going to get. He's never rushed more than 750 yards in a season. This is a team that runs a lot, especially with Lamar Jackson at the helm. If he does start again in Week 12, we're probably not going to see another 27 carries by a quarterback like that, but it does take significant touches away from your running backs. But I do think it also opens up some space when the running backs do get the ball. But for right now, I would consider him a great flex gamble in Week 12, maybe an RB3 with room to grow as an RB2 if he can sustain some kind of role like this. I think it's a long shot to turn into an RB2, but I think Gus Edwards, like I said, this week, good gamble. Moving on to number 3, Jalen Richard in Oakland, owned in 44% of Yahoo leagues. In Week 11, he rushed 11 times for 61 yards. He also had 3 catches for 32 yards. With Doug Martin nursing an ankle injury, John Gruden again coach praise with Richard. He said he could have a 1,000-yard rushing season as well as a 1,000-yard receiving season in the same year. I disagree with that, but I love the praise nonetheless. He looks like the lead back with a great stretch matchups. He's got Baltimore this week in Week 12. Looking down the road, Kansas City, Pittsburgh, Cincinnati, Denver, and Kansas City. All teams who are susceptible to running backs coming out of the backfield, especially catching the ball. I think he's a good flex play. He's an RB2 in PPRs. I would consider him in standard leagues, not PPR leagues, probably more of an RB3. But if you're in a PPR league, I do think you can start him as your second running back with confidence, at least in your flex with confidence. I do like Jalen Richard a lot moving forward. Coming in at number 4, Theo Riddick from Detroit, owned in 33% of Yahoo leagues. This is somebody who I would consider a flex at best most weeks, but I really do think you can start him with confidence in the flex position this week. 5 catches again in Week 11. I said last week that seems to be what his average is, about 5 catches. Over the last 3 weeks, 18 receptions, so it's a pretty safe floor with catches there. So if you're in a PPR league, you could use touches, you could use some catches. Theo Riddick's a good guy. We've got no Kerryon Johnson. Looks like Marvin Jones is going to be out too. So I really do think that they're going to be throwing a lot. The Lions will be throwing. I would consider Riddick a safe flex, low floor RB2, especially in PPR leagues. I think if there's a week to start Theo Riddick, it's this week. So Theo Riddick, you could do a lot worse. Have confidence in him this week on Thanksgiving. Sit back and enjoy him and get his. Number 5, Elijah McGuire from the New York Jets, owned in 14% of Yahoo leagues. He's coming off bye, so he might have even been dropped. He looked like a lone bright spot in the Jets offense Week 10. He had 6 rushes for 30 yards, 3 catches for 27 yards as well. I like him in PPR leagues down the stretch. In standard leagues, I do like him too, but significant more value in PPR leagues due to his versatility. And I like him this week in Week 12 versus the Patriots. I think that Obviously, the Jets should be down. They should be throwing. I think him and Chris Herndon look like the best receiving options they have. I think he scores 10-plus this week in PPR. I think he's a safe flex, low-range RB2 this week. And down the stretch, I really do like his chances. I think they've given him the ball, and he's shown some success. So Elijah McGuire, I think, is somebody who you definitely at least want on your team, on your bench. Maybe we talk about him as an RB2 moving forward, maybe not. But I think he has the potential, the opportunity to grasp that role. So I do like Elijah McGuire a lot moving forward down the stretch. Number 6, my last running back is from New England, Rex Burkhead, owned in 19% of Yahoo leagues. He's going to make his return, hopefully, from IR next week in Week 13. I think he could have a role in that offense. They're hurting at running back a little bit. We've seen both Sonny Michel and James White get a little banged up, so they might be trying to rest them up for playoffs. I don't think it's a guarantee, but he could return some flex PPR value. If it's a standard league, I'm probably not going to pick up Rex Burkhead. That's too much of a stretch. But if you're in a PPR league and you have a spot on your bench to burn, maybe somebody who burns you, a speculative ad who didn't do so well, you have room maybe with buys clearing up now after Week 12. I think you could do a lot worse of a stash than Rex Burkhead. So that's why he's number 6 on my list. Moving into our wide receivers, number 1 is going to be Anthony Miller from Chicago, owned in 42% of Yahoo leagues. Miller's had 6 or more targets in his last 4 of 5 games. In Week 11, he secured 2 receptions for 25 yards and a touchdown. If you're playing in a PPR league, over the last 4 games, he's had at least 10 points. So in PPR, he's had an additional value. I think he's the number 2 receiver there behind Allen Robinson. I would consider him a safe flex Thanksgiving night versus Detroit. So Anthony Miller is someone you want to have on your team down the stretch, owned in 42% of Yahoo leagues. Looks like the last week I'll talk about him. It's probably going to go up to 50-plus after this week. Moving on at number 2, Traquan Smith from New Orleans, owned in 27% of Yahoo leagues. He caught 10 of 13 targets for 157 yards as well as a touchdown in Week 11. And despite his huge game, I still think his role is a bit uncertain. I did drop him last week, regrettably, but I do understand why people dropped him. We see Brandon Marshall's going to come back now, and that might have scared some people away. I don't think Brandon Marshall's debut in Week 12, as expected, is going to be too much of an effect. I do think Traquan Smith should be considered the number 2 wide receiver in this offense moving forward, and I would expect him to be a strong upside flex in Week 12 versus Atlanta. Should be another shootout. Like I said, I'm hesitant to call him a lock for a start, but I really do think he's a strong upside gamble, and I do like Traquan Smith a lot moving forward, especially if he can show some consistency. That's been his downfall, has been here and there, kind of inconsistent. But it seems like when he's playing at home, he does fare a little bit better. He's got a home matchup and a shootout, likely shootout versus Atlanta. So I do see good things for Traquan Smith again in Week 12. Moving on to number 3, and that's Keke Coutee from Houston, owned in 31% of Yahoo leagues. Last week in Week 11, we saw him 9 targets. What did he do with them? He caught 5 of them for 77 yards. And I think what we're seeing is DeAndre Hopkins and Demaryius Thomas taking some attention, taking some coverage away on the outsides. So Keke Coutee's finding some holes and some space in the middle of the field. We saw, obviously, Demaryius Thomas. He had 0 catches in Week 11. I don't think that's an everyday thing. However, I think that Keke Coutee could be in line for a big workload on that offense going down the stretch run. And I do think Keke Coutee is someone who needs to be picked up in all leagues this week. We've seen him kind of fade back after that big breakout mid-season. And I don't see this game, Week 11, as a fluke. I see it as a sign of things to come, actually. So I like Keke Coutee a lot. I think he's a safe flex, wide receiver 3 in a caked matchup in Week 12 versus Tennessee. So I think he can repeat this performance and show why his stock needs to be owned a little bit more than 31%. Keke Coutee, my number 3 wide receiver. Go and get him. Moving on at number 4, Trey Quinn from Washington, somebody who I hyped up last week via Twitter. He's only owned in 1% of Yahoo leagues last week. Going into the week, he was owned in 0. So people are finally starting to catch on to Trey Quinn, catch wind of him, and for good reason, too. After an 8-game absence, he came back with 4 catches for 49 yards in the slot. Although he has a tough Thanksgiving matchup for Dallas, I think it could be a nice safety blanket for. We've seen McCoy now starting with that injury for Alex Smith. So I think Colt McCoy needs a safety blanket. I do like Jordan Reed a lot. He's somebody who I'm not going to talk about, obviously, on this list. He's over 50%, well beyond. However, I do like Jordan Reed a lot, as well as Trey Quinn, to be kind of the safety blankets for Colt McCoy. He doesn't have such a strong arm where he's going to make downfield throws. It doesn't matter if Jamison Crowder comes back. If anything, he's probably going to take an outside position slot. Maurice Harris kind of faded last week, disappointingly, and I do think Trey Quinn is going to be the main beneficiary there. He had a lot of draft hype as Mr. Irrelevant. He was the last pick, but I do think that a lot of people liked him, and for good reason too. I think he's a poor man's Cooper Kupp. As of now, that's what I'm gonna call him. I'm gonna claim him as that. So right now, especially in PPR leagues, I would consider him a wide receiver 4 with wide receiver 3 upside for the rest of the season. Trey Quinn, somebody who you could probably get away with playing in flex this week in PPR. He'll probably have 5 or 6 catches as he gains rapport with Colt McCoy in practice. But I do like Trey Quinn a lot moving forward. I think he could be a nice safety blanket, like I said. So that's why he's at number 4. Moving on to number 5, Josh Reynolds from the Rams, owned in 45% of Yahoo leagues. This is somebody who I would have probably cracked my top 3 had he been active this week. However, he's on bye for the Rams, and he also is at 45% owned. So that's why I tended to keep him down a little bit more on coming in at number 5. But Josh Reynolds, 6 catches for 80 yards and a touchdown week 11 in the shootout versus Kansas City. He almost even had his second touchdown, but his second foot was out of bounds. I don't expect this kind of consistency from him, but I do consider him a safe flex or wide receiver 3 rest of the season. This is somebody who, one of my friends asked me, what do you think about Josh Reynolds? I said probably 12 to 14 points. Well, excluding that touchdown, 6 catches and 80 yards, that would have been 14 points in your PPR leagues. So I do think the touchdown was obviously an additional bonus, but it also wasn't a fluke. I do think that Josh Reynolds, he has good red zone chemistry. He has good chemistry overall with Jared Goff going back to the end of the last season. And I do think now that Cooper Kupp has been injured, it kind of reassures that thought of why Josh Reynolds was kept around. I think he's a really good wide receiver in a really good position, really good opportunity here. Like I said, wouldn't expect these kind of games the rest of the season. I do think he'll hit and miss just like many other players in that offense. But I would say he's a safe flex, a wide receiver 3 for the rest of the season. Moving on to number 6 from Detroit, owned in 0% of Yahoo leagues, and that's Bruce Ellington. In Week 11, Bruce Ellington had 9 targets, caught 6 of them for 52 yards. We already had announced Kerryon Johnson will miss Thanksgiving game, and now it looks like Marvin Jones is likely out as well, depending on practice this week. So I think Bruce Ellington could again have a high-octane role in that offense. I would consider him a safe flex wide receiver 3 in PPR leagues for Week 12. If you're in a standard league, you're playing him as a flex and you're not having a second doubt about it. But I would consider him a little bit more valuable in PPR leagues. 9 targets, you can't shy away from that. So the Detroit boys out here, Bruce Ellington and Theo Riddick, both solid plays, both respective to their positions. Go pick both of them up. I like them. Moving on at number 7, Marcel Aitman from Oakland, owned in 0% of Yahoo leagues. This is another guy I hyped up last week via Twitter, and I did pick him up in a couple leagues. I did think he had an impressive debut, 4 catches for 50 yards versus the Cardinals. He did see a little bit of Patrick Peterson. He has another tough matchup against Baltimore, but I think you want him stashed on your bench. He could start opposing Jordy Nelson now that Brandon LaFell tore his Achilles tendon. He's out. He looked like their de facto number 1 receiver last week. So opportunities should be there for Marcel Aitman. Let's see if he can capitalize. I don't think he's a strong start. I wouldn't even consider him a flex for Week 12. But I think going down the road, looking forward past that, maybe in the playoffs, I think he's someone who might spark your attention. Marcel Aitman, 0% of Yahoo leagues. You could sure do a lot worse than him, I believe. Moving on to our tight ends. Number 1 is somebody who you might have shied away from because of a lackluster Week 11 performance, and that was Jeff Hireman from Detroit, owned in 23% of Yahoo leagues. Like I said, he disappointed in Week 11, only had 4 catches for 20 yards after that 10-reception effort in Week 9. But he does have a cake matchup versus the Pittsburgh Steelers in Week 12, so I don't recommend dropping him. As a matter of fact, I recommend starting him as a back-end tight end 1 in Week 12. So Jeff Hireman, if you are hurting there, go ahead and pick him up. Number 2 is Chris Herndon from the Jets, owned in 7% of Yahoo leagues. He once again led the Jets in Week 10 in receiving with only 3 catches for 34 yards. And I don't think that tells you that anything about Herndon. I think more so that tells you how bad the Jets' offense is. They're terrible. However, I do think that Chris Herndon can once again lead that offense in a Week 12 matchup with New England, who have been putrid against the tight end, letting many points up. So I would consider him a back-end tight end one due to his usage. So Chris Herndon, if you're hurting at tight end, maybe if you have someone on bye, Travis Kelce, you need a plug-and-play, I think you could do worse at tight end than Chris Herndon. 7% of Yahoo leagues, he's out there. If you need him, go and get him. Coming in at number 3, Cameron Brate from Tampa Bay, owned in 21% of Yahoo leagues. Listen, this guy doesn't have more than 34 yards receiving this season, so you're not counting on volume. If you're picking him up, it's based on the fact that Jameis Winston's back. We've seen, of course, they've had some proven chemistry years ago, time after time, but I would consider Brate a tight end 2, dart throw at best for this week. I don't think he's someone you want to start, even with the Winston factor playing in. I do think if you're picking him up, you want to put him on your bench, wait and see. And as a matter of fact, I'd only be picking him up if I'm really hurting at tight end. Say if I have Travis Kelce on the bye this week, I'm not even going to think about Cameron Brate because I don't like the start this week. I think it's a really risky investment. I think it's a bad gamble. So unless you have no depth at tight end, I wouldn't even consider Cameron Brate. However, I would consider him as a tight end 2, dart throw at best. So that's it for our offense. We're going to move now into our IDP side of things. And for our defense today, a little thin at defensive back, although we have a plethora of linebackers this week for you. So we're going to move first into our defensive backs. And number 1 is TJ McDonald from Miami, owned in 3% of Yahoo leagues. His 58 tackles combined lead Miami's defensive backs, and his 41 solo tackles are second in Miami's team, only besides Kiko Alonso. So I do like TJ McDonald a lot. He's had 16 tackles his last 2 games, so he's been showing up. He got a dream matchup with Indianapolis in Week 12. Couldn't ask for more. They allow the 3rd most fantasy points per game to defensive backs. I think he's a safe defensive back 1 add for Week 12. Coming in at number 2 from Philadelphia, Corey Graham, owned in 0% of Yahoo leagues. Graham is someone who's no stranger to IDP leagues. A couple years ago for Buffalo, he was a solid safety, solid tackler. He even returned punts. I don't think he's doing that now. However, he did have 9 tackles in Week 11 versus New Orleans. He was starting in place of Rodney McLeod, who was out. And I do think we're going to see him again versus the Giants this week. He's got a solid matchup versus Eli. I think that Eli and the Giants are going to try to do to Philadelphia what New Orleans did last week, and that is throw on them. So I would consider Corey Graham a safe defensive back 2 in Week 12. As long as he's starting in place of McLeod again, you might want to check that before game time. But if Graham is indeed starting, I would consider him a safe defensive back 2. Moving forward, coming in at number 3 is Josh Jones from Green Bay, owned in 1% of Yahoo leagues. 18 tackles over the last 3 games as he's been kind of propelled into a starter role there at safety. He's got a dream matchup versus Minnesota in Week 12. He's somebody who is averaging 6 tackles over his last 3 starts, so anywhere between 5 and 8 tackles. And maybe I would take the high road with this one. 8 tackles is my estimate for his matchup versus Minnesota. We assume they're going to be throwing a lot. So for this week, I would consider Josh Jones, although he's probably somebody who's not going to pique your interest due to consistency, but he has shown up 3 games. He's been safe in those last 3 games, so I would consider him a safe defensive back 2, Week 12. Moving on to number 4, Eddie Jackson from Chicago, owned in 7% of Yahoo leagues. He's had 12 tackles and 2 pick sixes the last 3 games. Yeah, not really a strong tackler. 12 tackles in his last 3 games isn't nothing to brag about. However, 2 pick sixes in his last 3 games is something to brag about for sure. I think he's a high ceiling, low floor kind of guy. I would consider Eddie Jackson to be a defensive back 2. Somebody who's not going to probably get you a lot of tackles, but he is a strong playmaker. He does make picks. He does make big hits. So I do think Eddie Jackson is, if you're hurting this week, you could do a lot worse at safety than Eddie Jackson. And number 5 is Anthony Harris from Minnesota. Probably somebody who you haven't heard of before, owned in 0% of Yahoo leagues. Although he only had 4 tackles, he did have 2 picks in Week 11. And he actually graded in as the number 1 safety recorded by Pro Football Focus in Week 11. I think he could stick as the starter. Obviously, he grades well in pass coverage, but he's a strong run defender too. I don't think it's a strong start on Thanksgiving versus Green Bay. It's a tough matchup, and he kind of came out of left field, so you're looking for consistency before you put him into a starting lineup. But I do think Anthony Harris, nonetheless, is somebody to keep a name on, put on your watch list. He could develop into a nice safety for Minnesota. Moving into our linebackers now. Number 1, 4 times in a row. This would be his 4th time in a row. Number 1 for me, Deion Jones from Atlanta, owned in 22% of Yahoo leagues. So that number's increasing finally. He's probable to return this week for Thanksgiving versus the Saints. Boy, do they need him back because their defense looks horrendous. When he comes back into that defense, I would resume his LB1, top-tier LB1 status. I do think that we're going to have to see him practice in these next couple of days. As of today, Dan Quinn said he was going to do some workouts, see how he's feeling, see how he's moving. It doesn't sound like overly confident from Atlanta, but I do think that Deion Jones, probably 60%, he makes his return this week based on the needs that they have him and if he's healthy enough to put on the pads. So if he does resume this week, I would immediately thrust him to that top-tier LB1. But if he doesn't, don't be surprised. So Deion Jones, nonetheless, my number 1 overall defensive ad this week. Coming in at number 2, Zach Cunningham from Houston, somebody I talked about last week. 4% of Yahoo leagues is owned. He didn't play Week 11 for the second straight week with that knee injury, although he's likely to return versus Tennessee. That's a cake matchup. He's had 32 tackles in his last healthy 3 games. If he does return this week, which I'd say probably about 65-70% chance that he does, I would consider him as safe LB1. Moving on to number 3, another guy who was injured from Cincinnati, owned in 4% of Yahoo leagues, and that's Nick Vigil. And Vigil hasn't played since Week 6. However, he's had 51 total tackles in his first 6 games, which is crazy. The depleted Cincinnati linebacker core need him back immediately. We've seen a lot of injuries there. Nick Vigil is no lock to come back this week. I do think they need him badly in Cincinnati. I would call him probable to return. Probably 50-60% chance he returns this week. You need to monitor that going into Sunday. So Nick Vigil, somebody who you definitely want on your team if he's active. He could be a great ad down the stretch for you, especially in playoffs. Nick Vigil, 4%. That's awfully low, so he's probably available in your league. Go and scoop him now. If he doesn't start in Week 12, he's probably going to come back 13, so he's a great stash if nonetheless. Coming in at number 4, Reuben Foster from San Francisco, owned in 7% of Yahoo leagues. Foster missed the last 2 games after exiting Week 8 with a hamstring injury, although he should return in Week 12 after practicing on a limited basis before Week 11 matchup. I do like his matchup in Week 12. He gets Tampa Bay. The offense is who's allowed the second most points to linebackers. I would consider him a safe linebacker too, with a high floor upon his return. So Reuben Foster, somebody who can help you out down the stretch, somebody who's probably dropped after that hamstring injury. So go ahead and pick him up. And coming in at number 5, my last defensive player is Adarius Taylor from Tampa Bay, owned in 1% of Yahoo leagues. Over his last 3 games, he's had 19 tackles as well as a forced fumble. In Week 11, he recorded 6 tackles and a forced fumble. He could be a decent linebacker too the rest of the season. We just got news that Kendall Beckwith, the second-year player from LSU, a linebacker who was going to come back and hopefully take over the man in the middle while Quan Alexander's out. That's not going to happen. He's shut down for the rest of the season, so it looks like they're going to roll with Adarius Taylor in the middle for them. He has a Week 12 cake matchup versus San Francisco, who's allowed the 4th most points to linebackers. So I think he's a particularly safe linebacker too in Week 12, and I would consider him a mid-range linebacker too moving forward the rest of the season. And that's all for this week's podcast, Week 12 on JohnnyFreakInFantasy. Make sure to go follow me on Twitter at JohnnyFreakInF1. Again, that's at JohnnyFreakInF1. I'll go answer all your sit, start needs, your matchup questions, all your trade advice, anything you got for me. Shoot it out there. Hopefully you like what you heard. If you do, go give me a follow on Twitter. Go give me a subscription on YouTube. I appreciate it in advance. And I hope you have a good Week 12. Have a happy Thanksgiving. Good luck this week. Enjoy your turkey and football. Johnny Freak in Fantasy out.